Today we are going to be multiplying and dividing integers. So let's take a look at our first type of problem that we're going to be dealing with. Well, here we're multiplying two integers. And again, integers are just numbers on the number line. And here we have 2 times by 3. So what does that mean? Well, I wrote down what it means. 2 times 3 means two groups of 3. So if I was to show you a picture of this, I would have two groups of 3. So it'd be like 3 dots here. There's one group, and then another group of 3 dots. That's what 2 times 3 is. So instead of having to add up or count up the number of dots, what we did is we learned an algorithm that we could just memorize 2 times 3 is 6, because it's 6 dots being added together. And so that's what that is. Well, how about if we had some negative numbers, like two groups of negative 3? Well, to show this, again, this means two groups of the opposite of 3. So if I had, instead of dots, this time I'm going to use minus signs to represent the 3. So negative 3 represents 3 minus signs. Two groups of negative 3. Notice that I have 6 minus signs. So two groups of negative 3 means that it's the same thing as negative 3 plus negative 3. Well, rather than adding up a series of numbers, we could just multiply. 2 times 3 is 6, but since I'm adding up groups of negatives, it's a negative 6. So it's the same thing over here. So think of it as when I've got two groups of 3 and it's in the opposite, it's a bunch of minus signs being added together, so it's going to stay negative. Well, how about this? How about if I put the minus sign in front of a 2? Well, what that means is the opposite of two groups of 3. So let's take a look at what that is again. Instead of the dots, I'm going to use plus signs this time for this. So I first have the opposite. Opposite means a minus sign. And then I've got the two groups of 3. So I've got a group of 3 here. And then I've got another group of 3 over here. Now notice I put this in parentheses because I got to combine all this stuff first. And so now I've got this minus sign because this represents the opposite. That's what that represents. So that minus sign means the opposite. The opposite of, well, this group of 3 and this group of 3 make a positive 6. So I've got 6 positives. But I want the opposite of this. Well, the opposite of 6 is negative 6. So notice that if we have just one minus sign, no matter where it is, in front of the first number or in front of the second number, it's always going to end up being a negative. Well, let's take a look at this last one here. We have the opposite of 2, or negative 2 times negative 3, which means the opposite of 2 groups of negative 3. So let's take a look at what that means. The opposite, again, is this minus sign. But I've got to group the numbers first, so I'm going to put it in parentheses. And I have two groups of negative 3, so two groups of negative 3. So I'm dealing with minus signs again. There's one group of negative 3. Here's the other group of negative 3. And so when I combine all these negatives here, I end up with negative 6. But I need to take the opposite of negative 6. So what would that be? Well, the opposite of negative 6 is on the other side of the number line from 0. It's positive 6. So notice that when both signs are the same, we always end up with a positive. When both signs are different, we end up with a negative. And that's the rule that you need to remember when you're multiplying or dividing. Because when we divide, it's the same rule for multiplication. Because all division is multiplication of the reciprocal. So we saw that when we dealt with multiplying fractions last year. So let's take a look at a little rule. If we have an odd number of negatives, so a negative times a positive, we ended up with a negative. When we had a positive times by a negative, we also ended up with a negative. But when we had two of the same sign, like if they're both negative or if they're both positive, we always end up with a positive. And so that's the rule that you're going to want to remember on these problems. And so tonight's homework is just multiplying some numbers and remembering that rule. So 9 times negative 8. So this means 9 groups of negative 8. And so I know it's 72, but it's negative 72 because I've got 9 groups of a negative. Over here, I've got the opposite of 7 times 7. Well, the opposite of 7 times 7, well, 7 times 7 is 49, but the opposite of that is negative 49. Here I've got the opposite of 5 groups of negative 6. And so I go ahead and multiply the 5 groups of negative 6, I get negative 30. But I've got to take its opposite. So the opposite of negative 30 is positive 30. Over here it's the same thing. It's the opposite of 4 groups of 8. So the opposite of 4 groups of 8. Well, 4 groups of 8 is 32. But I need to take its opposite. And so the opposite would be negative 32. Here we just have 8 groups of 10. 8 groups of 10 is just 80. And that's the answer. Here we have the opposite of 20 groups of negative 6. Well, 20 groups of negative 6 is going to make a bunch of negatives, 120 negatives. But I've got to take the opposite. So that ends up giving me positive 120. Well, let's take a look at our other problems that we have. We've got some division problems. Now again, when it says quotient, that just means we're going to end up dividing. But the rules with division are exactly the same. Same rules. Same sign means it's going to be a positive. Opposite signs means negative. And so the reason that's the case is because all division is multiplication of the reciprocal. So if I just wrote down 63, and I'll do it over here, 63 divided by negative 7, I can write that as a fraction, negative 7 over 1. I can write 63 as a fraction too. And when we dealt with division, we multiplied by the reciprocal. That's what we did. And so now notice that we're multiplying. See, we just have the one negative, and so we end up having to get a negative. And so when I divide negative 7 into 63, I end up with negative 9 because there's just one negative. So when I divide 48 by 4, by the negative 4, I have to take its opposite because it's the opposite of 48 divided by negative 4. And so I end up with the opposite of negative 12, which is positive 12. So when they're the same sign, you're going to end up with a positive. Opposite signs are going to make a negative. Here I have just opposite signs, so I end up with a negative because I have the opposite of 36 divided by 9. So I'm looking for 9. How many times does 9 go into 36? It goes in there 4 times, but I've got to take its opposite. So it's negative 4. Here it's the opposite of 81 divided by negative 9. So 81 divided by negative 9 makes a negative 9, but the opposite of a negative make a positive. So 2 negatives make a positive, 1 negative makes a negative. Here I just have 1 negative, so it's 80 I'm going to divide negative 10 into 80, and that goes in there negative 8 times. So 1 negative made a negative. 2 negatives like this one are going to make a positive because it's the opposite of how many times 12 or negative 12 goes into 60. Well, negative 12 goes into 60 negative 5 times, but I'm taking its opposite. And the opposite of a negative is a positive, and that's why that's the case each time. So 2 negatives make a positive, 1 negative makes a negative. And those are the rules with multiplication and division.